Hey, it's great to see all of you. It's great to worship with you. If you are new here, I want to welcome you. Covenant members, can we welcome our newcomers today? Very cool. I'm Howard. I'm the English ministry pastor here. It's great to have you. If you have questions about who we are and what we're like as a membership here, you can always check out our website. There's not a whole lot of content for you to navigate through. You can find what we believe in, who we are. You can check out our teachings that really show and display who we are as a church. And so if you're thinking about finding a church and you have questions, that's a resource available to you. And of course, you can always come chat with me and chat with any of our members. It's great to have you. Covenant members, it's great to have you and worship with you as well. We're looking at the book of Ruth today. I just want to share with you a story to just kind of kick us off. It's just going to be 2 weeks in Ruth, but I wanted to share a story with you. I started pastoral ministry when I was 24 years old, which is only like a couple years ago. And I'm kidding. I'm a lot older than that. But I started pastoral ministry when I was 24 years old. Raise your hand if you're 24. That's so crazy. That's so crazy. My first pastoral ministry was a junior high ministry, and I remember praying through it and deciding to make a decision to go for it. And I remember the senior pastor of the church said, okay, you're going to start the first week in January. Brand new year, brand new start, brand new ministry. And so I'm fired up, I'm geared up, I'm prayed up, I'm ready to go. And I remember literally 2 weeks before my first Sunday, the senior pastor says, our junior high group is going on a retreat. All the leaders have dropped out for whatever reason, and we just need you to take them. I'd never met these kids. I load the van with 15 junior high, middle school students. I literally don't know any of their names, right? And I'm trying to be enthusiastic and excited, and I'm driving a van load of kids to a retreat site. I take a whole bunch of wrong turns because junior high kids don't know how to navigate, and so we get there late, and everyone's tired and cranky. We missed the orientation. We barely make it for dinner, and all these junior high kids who I've never met are giving me the stink eye because we're late. I'm like, what do you want me to do? I don't even know your names. I'm lost. And so we go to the worship service, and this is a camp where it's like they do the camp for you. It's not like our own retreat. And so there's like 30 other churches out there. It's like this huge camp. It's at this place called Forest Home. And I remember I'm there sitting in the service, and I'm thinking, what am I doing? I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm 24. I'm responsible for 15 middle schoolers. I don't even know their names. I'm not even paying attention to the sermon, right? How ironic is that? And I'm like, God, what am I doing? And so finally the service is over. And what happens then is all the other kids go and do their activities. Now, I grew up in the Korean church, and I'm guessing that many of you did as well. And in the Korean church, when we go to retreats, we have our worship service, we have small group, and then we eat our ramen, right? And we all love Jesus together, right? That's how I did retreats, right? I'm not trying to be racist. All the other white kids, right, they do archery, they go rock climbing, they parachute out of planes, whatever kind of activities they have. They're doing all these extreme sports, and here I am with my 15 Asian kids doing small group, right? And so my kids are like, why can't we do activities? Why can't we do something fun? I'm like, we're going to do small group, yay. And I'm like gathering with these 15 kids. I wasn't even paying attention to the sermon, and so I'm trying to pull something out of my butt, and I'm like, okay, God, I'm going to do it. So I looked at the kids and I said, okay, listen, do you guys want to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? And then one kid goes, no, I want to play games. And so I somehow get through that small group, and these kids are like, who is this new pastor? What is he doing with us? And so I get them to go to sleep, which for junior high kids takes like 3 hours. And so it's like 2 a.m., and I step outside for a second. I sit against the door right on the porch, and I just start weeping. I cry, and I cry, and I cry, and I'm like, what am I doing here? And it was just this moment of failure And I wanted to quit pastoral ministry even before I got started. I have no idea what I'm doing with these kids. I'm way in over my head. I went in super arrogant, and God humbled me. Man, it was a hard, needless to say, I felt hopeless. And I think that God was teaching me something. I couldn't have said it at the time, but that was a moment where God was teaching me something. And I believe what God was teaching me at that moment was He was saying that there is no other hope, there is no other anchor, there is no other foundation in this life but God and God alone. And I want you to hear this, church. What God was teaching me was that sometimes we have to experience a bit of pain before we experience blessing. I think some of you know that really well. Sometimes we have to experience a bit of pain before we experience blessing. Psalm 30 says, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. The next day, I take these 15 kids and we do the whole camp thing, you know, and I'm praying. I'm like, God, I got a whole day of this now. What am I going to do? And somehow, by God's grace, He gets me through the day. We do the evening service, and all the white kids are doing their extreme sports, risking their lives, you know, whatever. And I'm here with my Asian group doing small group again. And I'm like, God, just get me through this. I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Just get me through this. And in the middle of my small group, I don't even know what I was talking about. In the middle of my small group, one of the older kids stops me, and he says, I was thinking about what you asked me last night, and I think I want to accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And eyes just tearing up. I just looked at him, and I said, okay, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, and I'm going to lead you through a prayer. But before I do that, I'm so sorry, what's your name again? I don't even know his name. But he accepted Christ at that moment. And I'm like, man, there's no better way to start pastoral ministry than this. By God's grace. I just had to get through that night of loneliness, of abandonment, of failure, and just trust in God. And if I could somehow, some way, go back to 24-year-old young Howard and tell them, you need to understand that God is sovereign and God is up to something. You don't know it yet. It's painful, it's frustrating, it's confusing, but God is up to something. We're starting in the book of Ruth today. God's sovereignty has everything to do with the story of Ruth. And what I mean is this. We just ended our series in Judges, and I'm not going to lie to you, Judges was hard. It's not easy preaching sin 5 consecutive weeks and then saying, let's pray, you know? It's not easy doing that. But the reason why Ruth is so awesome is because Ruth comes after the story of Judges, not just biblically speaking, but Ruth is the silver lining to Judges. You see, if Judges is the dark tunnel, Ruth is the light at the end of that tunnel. You see, if Ruth is the pain and suffering, then Ruth is the shred of hope. Psalm 30 says, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. If Judges is the weeping, then Ruth is the joy. One of the big questions that the story of Ruth answers is this. How do we find hope in our most painful and difficult seasons of life? How do we find hope? How do we find real, concrete, tangible hope in our most painful and difficult seasons of life? What we're going to see is that the overarching theme of Ruth is that God redeems His people. God redeems His people. It's this little love story between Ruth and a guy named Boaz, and God works His sovereignty to string together circumstances, to string together people masterfully, so that in this little love story, God works His sovereignty and He redeems Ruth. And listen, church, what I want you to remember from this short 2-week series is that if God can redeem Ruth, then God can surely redeem you. He can redeem us. Amen, church? This is what we get out of the story of Ruth. And just so you have some direction of what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to navigate ourselves today. I'm going to cover 2 chapters. I'm going to walk you through chunks of passage in chapter 1. At first, it may not seem like it's super relevant, but chapter 1 sets the stage for chapter 2. Our focus on God's sovereign work is going to be on chapter 2, but in order to understand and grasp and appreciate chapter 2, chapter 1 needs to lay the groundwork. So that's how I'm going to navigate my time today. So I want to read for you Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So here's what's happening. There's Elimelech, there's his wife Naomi, and then his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And there's a famine in the land. And that's ironic because they come from Bethlehem. Bethlehem literally translates to house of bread. Okay? Not in the sense of like house of carbohydrates. That would be like the modern equivalency. But more like bread as in a staple. So AKA house of food. So what's ironic here is that they're in Bethlehem, a place of abundance where food never really runs out. It's literally called house of food, and there's a famine. And so Elimelech, what he does is he gathers his family, says, something's not working here, we got to do something, I got to provide for my family, and so he takes his family and it goes to Moab, which is significant, but we'll come back to that. And so what happens then is Elimelech dies. It's not so tragic because his wife Naomi has his 2 sons. But they also die. Now it's tragic. The Bible doesn't tell us how they die. That's not an important detail. But what is an important detail that we have to understand? It is Naomi, it is Orpah, and it is Ruth. In other words, it is 3 widowed women. In our day, I believe that we're striving to give equal opportunity for men and women. We live in a day and age that's way more progressive than this culture. In this culture, there was a very clear separation, a very clear distinction between men and women. Women, simply put, did not have the kind of opportunities that men had. Women were considered second-class citizens. Women weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't educated. Their role was to stay home and rear the kids. The man's job was to fight. The man's job was to protect, make money, work, and all that. And so then what would happen if a woman lost her husband and she became a widow? We're talking really, really bad news. We're talking that they're the same social class now as orphans. They're the same social class as beggars. So now what we're seeing here is not 1 widow, but 3. So Naomi takes her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and they set back to go to Judah, but then she tells them to go back to their homes. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read, but what happens here is there's this really powerful and really heartfelt and really emotional moment. 3 widows, both young and old, who are experiencing the season of pain, the season of worry and struggle. They gather together, they embrace each other, and they weep. Naomi is saying goodbye to her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and they're clinging on to each other, and it's this bittersweet, emotional moment where they're saying, I don't want to leave, but I must. You see, when you're in the thick of the darkness, when you're in a time of deep, deep wilderness, of pain, of suffering, there's no real truth in the world at that moment that can bring any kind of encouragement to you. But for some weird reason, when you know that someone out there is experiencing the same thing as you, there's this weird and odd sense of comfort that you sense. I just want to make a quick point about this. You see, when someone is laying out in a very honest way their struggle, and for us as covenant members, a lot of us are in small groups, right? And that's kind of our platform to share. Maybe it's a close friend, maybe it's family. They're just being honest, and they're sharing it with such heartfelt honesty, the things that they're going through, sometimes you just need to stop and weep with them. It's not about truth at that moment. Do you realize that? Can you imagine interjecting yourself into this narrative as the three widows have no hope for the future? Are you really going to say, hey, you just need to stop crying and trust that God is sovereign? Are you really going to say that? Is God sovereign? Absolutely. Yes and amen, church. But at that moment, sometimes you just need to stop, get into their mess, and cry. Verse 10. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. It's really weird what Naomi is saying. She's basically saying, I'm too old to get married and have baby sons for you to marry. Now, I'm just going to be really honest. That's really weird. That's just really weird. I understand that when you're under high pressure and there's a lot of stress and you get really emotional, you just say crazy things that you don't mean, right? Myself included. Hey, bro, how's finals week going? I just need my space. Like, it's like, you know what I'm saying? Like, okay, I get it. You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's what Naomi's doing. Right? She's saying, am I going to marry someone and you're going to marry my son? You're going to wait, like 15, 18 years? That's just really weird. And it's almost like she's speaking out of her emotion under this high pressure and stress. But that's not, in fact, what she is doing. What she is referring to is a cultural practice. They called it kinsman redeemer. In other words, it's family redeemer. And we're actually going to hit this more next week when we talk about chapters 3 and 4. But it was this cultural practice where if a woman was widowed, she had a husband, he died, and she is widowed, and she has no future and no hope, the brother of the husband, if he was single, he would take the responsibility of marrying that woman so that now he has a wife, she has a husband, and that woman is now redeemed. She now has a hope for the future. She's not crazy talk, what she's talking about. To us it is, because that kind of practice is weird, but that was culturally accepted. It was good, it was beneficial, it was constructive and beneficial to society. That's what she's referring to here. Orpah listens to Naomi, and she goes back home, but not Ruth. And what we're going to read next is one of the most amazing statements of loyalty that you will ever find. Verse 15, and she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything, but death parts me from you. I can't help but just get so excited and just be amazed by this. To me, this is not so much let's unpack and let's deconstruct and let's study the text. This is more about stopping, just examining real quick, and just being so astounded by her loyalty. This is just amazing. I just feel like I could just say that over and over. This is just so amazing. And I think the greater picture that we have to see is not actually Ruth. We can examine Ruth, and I think that would be worth our time. If we had more time, I would be like, sisters, look at Ruth. That's the kind of woman you should strive to be. Look at her attributes. Look at her qualities. And I would say, if I had time, brothers, look at Ruth. That's the woman you should try to marry. Brothers, can you imagine you marrying someone, and if something, God forbid, would happen to you, and your woman stayed and said, I will take care of your parents. That is a woman that you want to keep. We don't have time for that. Okay, what's happening here is we can't look at Ruth, we have to look at God. Ruth re-engages, redirects our attention so that we look at God. Why? Let's read this again. She says, where you will go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. I believe that was her born-again moment. That's where she's transformed into believing God to be a redeemer. She says, where you die, I will die. That's basically a marriage vow. And I'm going to say this over and over again. It's so amazing because what she is saying is, I didn't just marry your son, I married your entire family. It's not just you, it's your entire family. I will commit myself even to my death. So how does this point us to God? I need you to listen. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people. Now listen. Where you die, I will die. This has gospel written all over it. This is covenantal language. Just all throughout. This is straight up God looking at his people and saying, I will go where you go. And your people will be my people. And through the cross, where you die, I will die. You see, the thing is, there's nothing that Jesus would have received by saying those things. And Scripture proclaims this wonderful language, how the church is married to Christ. In this wonderful theological, spiritual language, God is saying the relationship that I have with the church, my people, is not like a shepherd and sheep. It's not like a teacher and a student, but it's like a husband and his wife. And this is marital, covenantal, vow language. And it points us to God. And the message rings true in the same way that God redeems Ruth, God is redeeming us. Go to verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Naomi changes her name to Mara, which means bitter. And if you've been with me, then you know I've said this many times, but names in the Bible is really, really important. For us, names are just something you call someone. Biblically speaking, name was your identity. Name was your purpose. Name was who you were. So what Naomi is doing is a very, very powerful thing. She's actually forcibly changing her identity, changing her purpose to be from Naomi to Mara, which means bitter. Now, if you can't just for a moment put yourself in Naomi's place, because I can't help but think, maybe this is you. Maybe you can identify with Naomi. Maybe you're in a season of pain. Maybe you're in a season of confusion, of wilderness, suffering. Maybe you're in a season where you actually feel like, and this is the thing, because if you're church and you're Christian, we don't like saying this out loud because we know it's theologically wrong, but how we feel is that maybe you're in a season where you are actually bitter against God. And we're not allowed to say that, right? But maybe it's true. Maybe how you feel is that on Sunday you'll put on your Sunday best and you will worship, but there's this harboring resentment. This little dark place of the soul, the heart, where you are harboring this bitterness, this resentment, this anger against God because of the circumstance that you're in. That's Naomi. She is changing her identity to be bitter. And if that's you, man, you need to hear this. The point of today's message is that God is both sovereign and loving. And if God is both sovereign and loving, it could be that the tough season you're in now is because God is setting up for you a season of blessing. Do you hear me, church? Because Psalm 30 says, weeping will tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. The reason I need to make a point about this is because in order for Ruth chapter 2 to make any sense, we need to lay the groundwork of Ruth chapter 1. If Ruth 1 is bitterness, if Ruth 1 is pain and suffering and hopelessness, then what is Ruth 2? Chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the clan of Elimelech. So this is really important to understand. It says that Ruth went to glean in the fields. Now, glean just simply means to collect or to extract. So the owners of the grain fields, what they would do is they would have this big plot of land. Now imagine you are an owner of a field, of a grain field, and imagine this big square, this big plot of land. And you don't actually do the work. You hire people to do the work. And what you're going to tell your workers is, I want you to go from each corner to corner to corner, and I want you to gather everything. Don't waste anything because that's my money. I need to make a profit. So what's happening now is in this economy where there is no welfare, where there's no governmental support system for widows, what God says is this. The Gentiles will do what they want. People who don't love me and pursue me or love my law, they will do what they want. But you as my people, here's what you will do. You will go from corner to corner to corner in this big plot of land, and you will leave space. You will leave the outskirts, untouched grain and wheat. Why? So that beggars, so that widows can come, they can find work, and they can feed themselves. You see, God is amazing. Do you know why? In God's kingdom economy, you know what God values? Not profit, not money, but people. This should stir something in your church, because what God is doing is He's saying, don't give beggars and widows money, give them work. Why? Because work is dignity. Work restores you. Work redeems you. Don't just give them a free handout, give them work. Then they will find identity. Then they will find purpose. In God's kingdom economy, God is about getting the outsiders to be welcomed as insiders. In God's kingdom economy, it's about welcoming the outcasts of society. In God's kingdom economy, it's about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In God's kingdom economy, it's about giving voice to those who don't have a voice. This is the God we worship, and this is what God is doing now. This is what we call social justice. So in a culture where there's no such thing as welfare, in a culture where Gentiles would reap all of their wheat from corner to corner, God commands His people, the Israelites, don't reap all of the wheat. Leave space. So Boaz understands this truth. He understands God's heart, and so he leaves space. Why? Who is there to reap? Ruth, the Moabite beggar, the Moabite widow. Verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? In other words, dang, who's a fine girl over there? Sorry. And verse 6, and the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Church, let me ask you something, and I need your involvement in this. Who here likes romantic comedies? I won't shame you, I promise. Yeah? Okay. Who here likes movies that are love stories? Y'all a bunch of liars. I know at least half of you. At least half of you. I'm just going to assume that you're lying. It's church. Okay, it's okay. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to say yay or nay. I'm going to say movie, and I want you to say yay or nay. I promise I won't embarrass you. I won't call you up. I won't do any of that. Okay? If you leave this guilty, that's on you. Okay, that's not me. Okay? I just want your involvement. Yay or nay. Okay? 50 First Dates. Titanic. Those are kind of old, right? I'll be more relevant here. To All the Boys I've Ever Loved. Notice all the sisters saying this. I don't know, Korean dramas. What do all these movies have in common? Think about it. I mean, there's a lot that's in common, but one of the things that all these movies have in common is that when the guy meets the girl, when the girl meets the guy, there's this encounter. There's this part in the movie where the guy will bump into the girl at the coffee shop. She'll fall over, he'll catch her, they'll lock eyes, and they'll fall in love. There's this scene in every Korean drama where a guy runs through the rain to the hospital, gets hit by a car. You know, it's just, I don't know, right? I've not that I know, right? But I'm just saying, that's just what happens, right? And what do all the girls do? Oh! And what do the guys do? You gotta be kidding me! That never happens! You know what I'm saying? And if you're in a relationship, if you're married, you're dating, all the guys will look at the girls, right? And the girls look at the guy, right? And she's crying, and the guy was like, oh, brother, now I gotta do this. Like, what's happening? Right? You got to be kidding me. That never happens. Because what's the whole premise? That they never preach at you, but they're actually, what do they really say? All the stars have aligned, right? So that guy and girl can meet. The universe has put you guys together. What do we call that? Soulmates. What do we call that? What does our culture call that? Fate. That's what our culture calls that. What does the Bible call this here? It was God. It wasn't the universe. It wasn't some mystical thing out there. It was God bringing Ruth, bringing Boaz. Just it so happened to be at the right time, at the right place, so that Ruth would be redeemed. It's not some cheesy love story that we're looking at where we go, oh, all the stars have aligned. It is God. You see, this is God working his sovereignty. At all the places they could be, Ruth, a Moabite begging widow, would be redeemed by Boaz. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? That's protection. He's saying you're going to leave that woman alone. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. A Moabite woman is drinking among Israelite men. I don't know if you're hearing that. Verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to them, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? God's grace, that's why. Verse 11, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Church, what we see here isn't a collection of random events. This is God's sovereignty at work. Ruth staying loyal to Naomi wasn't by chance. Naomi telling Ruth to glean in the field wasn't by chance. Ruth being allowed to glean in that field wasn't by chance. Boaz noticing this poor widow was not by chance. Listen, do you think the famine was by chance? Highly suspect, isn't it? That the house of bread, the house of food, would all of a sudden turned into a famineous place. Can you believe that? Can you believe that God actually might cause an economic crisis in a land? That's God's sovereignty at work. And if the Bible is giving us this profound story about God working to redeem Ruth, then surely we must believe that God is at work now redeeming us. We need to understand something about the Moabites. There's a lot of history at play here. Back in Genesis, we come across a guy named Abraham. You know Abraham. Abraham has a bunch of sons. One of them, his name is Lot. Lot is a hot mess. If you don't know who Lot is, get to know him. He's a hot mess. Why? Lot impregnates his own daughter. We're talking straight up Jerry Springer stuff here. Okay? Hot mess, depravity. Now what happens is Lot impregnates his own daughter, and from that incestuous relationship comes an entire nation called Moab. When a daughter impregnates his daughter, when a father impregnates his own daughter, an entire nation comes out of that. We have cultures, we have values, we have lifestyles that are all about sexual perversions. It's all about moral depravity. It's just a moral corruption of an entire nation of people. Do you know who was a Moabite? Ruth. Who does God redeem in this narrative? Not an Israelite, not even a man, but a Moabite woman. And over and over and over in the book of Ruth, what we see is when the author refers to Ruth, he doesn't just say Ruth, he says Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite. In today's standard, we call that racial profiling. Hey, you know Howard the Korean? What does me being Korean have to do with anything? Ruth the Moabite. Why? The author is saying something. Pay attention to the language. Ruth the Moabite, in a beautiful love story about God redeeming Ruth. God welcomes the outcast. God welcomes outsiders, and he redeems, and he redeems, and he redeems. If God is so willing to work his sovereignty to redeem a Moabite woman, then surely, church, you must believe that God is at work to redeem you. I want you to think about this. And here's where I'm going to land today. Think about where you are today. Not just physically here at church, but in your physical life circumstance. Think about your job. Think about your family context. Think about your faith. Think about your family. Think about everything about where you are. And I know that human tendency, because of our human condition, it's so much easier to focus on what we don't have than what we do have. But I want you, just for now, to just remember and focus on everything that you are and everything that you have. Do you think that was you? That if you are a born-again believer, you have an assurance of faith, and you believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, was that you? I don't like saying this and broadcasting this, especially when there's newcomers in the house, but that's arrogance. That is straight up spiritual arrogance. To reap all the rewards that you are sitting on today and thinking that it was you. If you are a born-again believer here today, someone prayed for you. You better believe it. A friend prayed for you to accept Christ. A family member, a church leader, a pastor, someone prayed for you. If you are here today reaping blessings, it's because someone yesterday sacrificed. We have to believe that God in his sovereign work has brought you here. And my point is this. Blessings aren't coincidences. The goodness in your life is not by chance. If you have something good today, it's because someone yesterday sacrificed for you. And it could be that some of you in this room need to hear this message today, because it could be that the season that you're now in is Ruth chapter 1. It could be that your story is Naomi's story in chapter 1. There is weeping, there is bitterness, there is anger, there is confusion. Psalm 30 says there's weeping that tarries in the night, but joy comes in the morning. There is hope available for you. if you trust and you cast and you put your rest in the sovereign work of God, there will come a Ruth chapter 2 when God will string together events, string together circumstances, string together people so that you can experience life, hope, and joy once again. And what we're going to see is that there is a joy of all joys, and I'm not just talking about circumstances now. I'm not just talking about getting a better paycheck. I'm not just talking about relationships, but there is a joy of all joys, a life of all lives. Because do you know when Ruth gets together with Boaz, who will come from a descendant of theirs? Jesus Christ, who is our hope of all hopes, who is the Redeemer of all redeemers. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Hope is available for you, church. Let's believe in that. Pray with me.